module, you shall be able to define the key components of operant conditioning, describe types of reinforcements and punishments and their effects on behavior, identify different types of reinforcers, and know the major schedules of reinforcement. You already know that the American psychologist B.F. Skinner gave the idea that consequences are important in influencing behavior. He borrowed the concept of behavior being controlled by rewards and punishments from Edward Thorndike, who had demonstrated that hungry animals would work diligently to solve a problem by trial and error to obtain reward in terms of food. This module will familiarize you with the components of operant conditioning further. In the next section, key components of operant conditioning such as reinforcement, punishment, shaping, and so forth will be discussed. In the previous module, the differences between classical conditioning and operant conditioning were also highlighted. Following those, we know that the type of conditioning that involves operant behavior is called type R because of the emphasis on response. There are two general principles associated with type R conditioning. 1. Any response that is followed by a reinforcing stimulus tends to be repeated. Second, a reinforcing stimuli is anything that increases the rate with which an operant response occurs. Or we can say that a reinforcer is anything that increases the probability of a response occurring. Skinner demonstrated that the occurrence of any behavior depends upon whether it is followed by a reward or a punishment. To understand these better, let us know what is meant by reinforcement and punishment. In behavioral psychology, to reinforce a particular behavior is to strengthen it. Reinforcement is a consequence that strengthens the occurrence of a desired behavior. Reinforcement occurs when either a response adds something positive to the situation or removes something negative from the situation. Each one increases the probability of a response occurring. Reinforcement is of two types, positive and negative, both of which increase the probability of a behavior's occurrence. A positive reinforcer is something which, when adds to a situation by a certain response, increases the probability of that response occurring. A negative reinforcer is something which, when removed from a situation by a certain response, increases the probability of that response reoccurring. For example, if a Skinner box is arranged so that an aversive tone is discontinued when the lever is pressed, the lever response will soon be learned. In this case, the pressing of the lever, the animal avoids experiencing an aversive stimulus. Children and adults also learn to behave in accordance with the rewards or punishments that follow certain behaviors. For children, commonly rewarding consequences include food, praise, or hug by a parent, money, grades, all of which can increase or encourage the behavior that they follow. All these tend to work as primary reinforcers. By contrast, punishment is an aversive consequence that weakens the behavior it follows. Unlike reinforcement, punishment also comes in two main forms. One, called positive punishment, which requires the application of an aversive stimulus, as when you touch a hot plate, the painful consequence reduces the likelihood of your repeating that behavior. The other main form of punishment, known as negative punishment, results from the removal of a reinforcer, as when parents, such as watching the favorite cartoon or a movie. It is important to note that punishment occurs when a response removes something positive from the situation or adds something negative. In simple words, we can say punishment is either taking away something an organism wants or giving it something it does not want. Common punishments such as pain, loss of privileges, or low grades can discourage the behavior with which they are associated. Note that negative reinforcement should not be confused with punishment. In fact, punishment and negative reinforcement are used to produce opposite effects on behavior. Punishment is used to decrease a behavior or reduce its probability of occurring. However, negative reinforcement, like positive reinforcement, always increases a response probability of occurring again. And remember that the descriptors positive and negative mean add and remove. Thus, both positive reinforcement and positive punishment involve administering or adding a stimulus. On the other hand, negative reinforcement and negative punishment always involve withholding or removing a stimulus. Let us now try to understand secondary reinforcement. Any neutral stimulus paired with a primary reinforcer, for example food or water, takes a reinforcing property of its own. This is the principle of secondary reinforcement. The secondary reinforcer consistently precedes primary reinforcement. In other words, a stimulus that accompanies reinforcement thereby acquires reinforcing properties or value of its own and may be called a conditioned secondary or derived reinforcement. For example, if a light comes prior to the animals receiving food for making a liver press response in the Skinner box, then according to the principles of secondary reinforcement, the pairing of light with food should cause the light to take in reinforcing properties of its own. The same principle operates when a hungry child stops crying at the sight of the mother, even before being fed. The child pairs the secondary reinforcer, that is the mother, with the primary reinforcer, the milk. Now let us move on to generalized reinforcement. A generalized reinforcer is a secondary reinforcer that has been paired with more than one primary reinforcers. Money is a generalized reinforcer because it is associated with a number of primary reinforcers. Grades, trophies, medals and rewards also classify to be general reinforcers. These all have reinforcing tendencies and can be used to increase the occurrence of desired behaviors. Besides reinforcements and punishments, there are other types of concepts such as shaping, chaining and extinction that help get a grasp on operant conditioning. Let's also try to understand these. One of the approaches to operant conditioning is shaping. To get clarity on it, let us go back to Skinner box that you have already done in the previous modules. In the Skinner box where the animal is kept on a deprivation schedule, the experimenter tries to fire the food even when the animal is in the half of the Skinner box containing the liver. When the animal is reinforced for being near the liver, it will tend to remain in that part of the test chamber. Now that the animal remains in the vicinity of the liver, the experimenter begins to reinforce it only when it is still close to the liver. Next, it is reinforced only when it touches the liver, then only when it is putting pressure on it, and finally only when it is pressing it by itself. This process of shaping the organism's behavior is called shaping. Shaping can be used to bring behaviors close enough to the desired behaviors until the desired behaviors are fully attained. In shaping, reinforcement is presented for varying successive approximations in form of behavior as they approximate the eventual behavior to be learnt. Step by step, the organism comes to engage in behaviors that slowly approximate closely to the desired behavior. Eventually, only the target behavior is the one that is reinforced. Shaping has two components: differential reinforcement, which means some responses are reinforced and others are not, and successive approximation, which refers to the fact that only those responses are reinforced that become increasingly similar to the experimenter wants. Let's now do chaining. Related to shaping is another concept in operant conditioning, and this process is called chaining. Chaining is used to condition an individual to produce a specific series or sequence of different behaviors before the final behavior is reinforced. One response can bring the organism into contact with stimuli that acts as a secondary reinforcer to another response, which in turn causes it to experience stimuli that caused a third response, and so on. This process is called chaining. Most behaviors can be shown to involve some form of chaining. As with classical conditioning, when we remove the reinforcer from the operant conditioning situation, we produce extinction. During acquisition, the animal gets a pellet of food whenever it presses the lever. Under such a situation, the animal learns to press the lever and persists in doing so until it is satiated with food. But if suddenly we prevent lever press from producing a pellet of food, we observe that the lever pressing response stops. Thus, after extinction, the response rate goes back to where it was before reinforcement was introduced. The response goes back to the operant level. However, the ease with which a behavior is extinguished varies according to several factors, including the strength of the original learning, the variety of settings in which learning had taken place, and the schedule of reinforcement used during conditioning. You are aware that students get reinforced for studying with grade and marks more than once a year. Periodic assessment maintains academic behaviors by encouraging continual studying rather than studying only at the end of semesters. This example will help you understand that in operant learning situations, the timing and frequency of rewards are crucial. How often will reinforcement be given? How much work is needed to earn a reinforcer? Will every response be reinforced, or will reinforcement occur only after a certain number of responses? These questions will be addressed in the next discussion that we are going to hold. It will elaborate the possible ways of associating responses and reinforcers to determine behavior patterns of organisms. Skinner studied the partial reinforcement effect extensively and eventually wrote a book with Pfister called Schedules of Reinforcement. This book summarizes years of research on various types of partial reinforcement. 5 schedules of reinforcement have become the most common, and these will be discussed. In continuous reinforcement schedule, each response is followed by a reinforcer. This is helpful in learning new behaviors such as learning to play a musical instrument, as after each response, feedback in form of reinforcer can be given. But when reinforcement is given after each response, the chances of the organism to satiate with the reinforcer are higher. Using a partial reinforcement schedule, every correct response during acquisition is reinforced. Usually in a partial reinforcement schedule, the animal is first trained on 100% reinforcement and then switched to partial reinforcement schedule. It is difficult to train an animal on a partial reinforcement schedule in the initial training period. Next, using a fixed interval reinforcement schedule, the animal is reinforced for a response made only after a set of interval time. For example, only a response following a 2-minute interval is reinforced. At the beginning of the fixed time interval, the animal responds slowly or not at all. As the end of time interval approaches, the animal gradually increases the speed of responding, apparently anticipating the moment of reinforcement. Here the behavior of an animal under the schedule resembles a person when he or she has to meet a deadline. After putting off a certain task as long as possible, as the deadline approaches, the activity increases accordingly. Often students preparing assignments and term papers act in this manner. A paycheck at the end of a month for an employee or a student who prepares for weekly unit tests are actually anticipating fixed interval reinforcement. Next, a fixed ratio reinforcement schedule. A fixed ratio reinforcement schedule occurs when every nth response that the animal makes is reinforced. FR3 means the animal will get reinforced at every third response. Here, the important factor determining when a response is reinforced is the number of responses made. With a fixed ratio schedule, the animal must respond a fixed number of times but when it is reinforced. In human situations, when an employee is credited for each item produced, he or she is being reinforced on a fixed ratio schedule. Let us now move on to variable interval reinforcement schedule. With the variable interval schedule, the animal is reinforced for responses made at the end of time interval of variable situations. That is, rather than having a fixed time interval, as with FI schedules, the animal is reinforced on the average, say every 2 minutes, but it may be reinforced immediately after a prior reinforcement, or it may be reinforced after 30 seconds or after 6 minutes. Moving on to variable ratio reinforcement schedule. With the fixed ratio schedule, an animal is reinforced after making a specific number of responses. But with variable schedule, say VR3 schedule, the animal is reinforced on the average of every 3 responses. Thus, it might receive 2 reinforcers in a row or make 10 responses without being reinforced. The VR schedule eliminates the step-like cumulative recording found with the FR schedule and produce the highest response rate of the 5 schedules considered above. The VR schedules eliminate the step-like cumulative recording found with the FR schedule and produce the highest response rate of the 5 schedules considered above. The VR schedule is the one that governs the behavior of gamblers. The fastest one pulls the handle of a slot machine, the more frequently one is reinforced. To summarize, if an organism receives a reinforcer every time it makes an appropriate response during learning and then placed on extinction, it will extinguish faster than an organism who had only a certain percent of its correct responses reinforced during acquisition. In other words, partial reinforcement leads to greater resistance to extinction than continuous reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement yields the least resistance to extinction and the lowest response rate during training. All partial reinforcement schedules produce a greater resistance to extinction and higher response rate during training than continuous reinforcement. Ordinarily, the VR schedule produces the highest response rate, FR produces the next highest rate, and then VI followed by FI and finally CRF. Let us quickly summarize what we've already done. The type of conditioning that involves operant behavior is called type R because of the emphasis on response. Any response that is followed by a reinforcing stimulus tends to be repeated. Reinforcement is a consequence that strengthens the occurrence of a desired behavior. Reinforcement is of both types, positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Both of these increase the probability of a behavior's occurrence. Punishment is an aversive consequence that weakens the behavior it follows, and it is also of two types, positive and negative punishment. Any neutral stimulus that accompanies reinforcement thereby acquires reinforcing values of its own and may be called a conditioned, secondary or derived reinforcement. A generalized reinforcer is a reinforcer that has been paired with more than one primary reinforcer. In shaping, reinforcement is presented by varying successive approximations in form of behavior as the organism comes to engage in behaviors that slowly approximate closely to the desired behavior. Chaining is used to condition an individual to produce a specific series or sequence of desired behaviors before the final behavior is reinforced. We have also done 4 major schedules of reinforcement that are fixed ratio, fixed interval and variable ratio.